children to learn language. So some of the supports for the cognitive theory of language development is that it really represents the reality of young children, and so the kinds of behaviors that they're talking about in terms of children interacting with their world and becoming more knowledgeable about their world based on these experiences with their world, it definitely is sort of reflective of what we actually know happens for children. And we also have evidence that there's some basic concepts that do precede expression, and so this idea of object permanence needing to be in place, there's been studies that have shown that that's absolutely true. Before, children have to have object permanence before they acquire first words, and so we have some empirical evidence that some of these skills, these cognitive skills, do provide that foundation for language. And then the other piece is that a support would be that it potentially just situates language within this idea, within the category of child development more broadly. So that last one, talking about situating language within child development, it's really making a connection about what's happening in the child's world and really some developmental perspectives of things that we're seeing more advances in their language based on this advances in cognitive development. So those developmental sequences are really matched well. But then some of the challenges for this piece of things, some people talk about just because things develop at the same time, they may not be related. So for example, we know kids will produce first words at about the time that some of these sensory motor skills are well established, like means end and causality and so on. We also know that two-word combinations evolve in children right around the time that they start putting like two objects together in meaningful ways in terms of how they're interacting with the world, with just some schema related kinds of things. So a child who would feed a baby, a pretend activity, feed a baby and give it a drink, it's about that same time that we see two-word semantic relationships evolving, but just because they're evolving at the same time doesn't necessarily mean that those two things are related. We also have cases where we know that language and cognition develop distinctively from each other, and for the most part that's not true. We see that kids who have very significant cognitive deficits also have very significant language deficits, but there are cases, Williams syndrome is one of them, where we see children having very poor cognitive skills and more well-developed verbal language, and so there's a mismatch there. And then we have the case of like Jeannie, who had limited cognitive growth with very limited syntax, and even when she started to have experiences in the world, when she was rescued from her situation and having more cognitive growth, we still continue to see really significant limitations in syntax. And so that was another place where those two things just don't seem to be aligning one-to-one. Okay. Two other theories that I'm going to just talk about briefly because there's a fair amount of research in these areas, or there's conversations in the literature, but they don't tend to ever really connect with what we're doing just as speech-language pathologists. So they're much more theoretical models of language development that don't necessarily connect very closely with actually observing children and seeing how children interact and learn language. They're more theoretical pieces of things, but just so that you're familiar with them because you may hear about them. In the competition model, the suggestion is that children learn language forms they hear most frequently. And a lot of this was based on this idea of sentence interpretation. And so the research that has been done has to do more with sort of modeling and simulation versus actually giving children specific sentences to process and then see what happens. But this idea is that children get a sentence and they have to think about different possibilities of what a sentence could mean based on cues from morphology, syntax, semantics. You can kind of think back to that bootstrapping theory that we talked about a little bit ago. And so the idea here is that different components of language compete for the understanding, and eventually one will win out over another. So take the model, thankfully she went home. So is that thankfully she went home like you're so glad she left, or is it thankfully she went home so she was very glad that she got to go home? And so that would be the idea that there's competing ways you could interpret a sentence, and based again on cues from morphology and potentially the syntax of sentences around it and some other semantic meanings and so on, children are going to make a decision based on those that information. And then the connectionist model, again, a fair amount of research done at a pretty high theoretical level, which is really computer simulated learning of language. In this model, components of a program have been created. I mean, the software is written so that there are these nodes that are representing neurons on the brain. And what happens is that they're teaching through algorithms. They're providing input to the computer system about, most of the work has been done with the idea of present and past tense ED, and as data is fed to the system, it allows for connections between algorithms to be strengthened and weakened. And so then there's this output that happens with the data to see whether a past tense ED ending is created or whether it's not, which would sort of connect with this idea of irregular verbs. And so again, very theoretical, pretty complex, high-level systems, but computer simulated language learning. And the interesting part is that they've been able to represent some of this information about how past tense ED actually is learned with these computer models, which sort of gives some support to ideas about data and data input and how that's really informing our language system about how we're learning. And then the last area we're going to talk about is the pragmatic model. Pragmatic model comes from a perspective that children really have a desire to interact with each other. Not children, people have desire to interact with each other, and this drives communication. And so children come to the world highly motivated to want to interact, and so that's what's sort of pushing things forward. And that the development of syntax and semantics are just a result of the intent to communicate. They're kind of a byproduct, sort of an aftermath, after effect of this primary communication need of things. And out of the speech model comes the speech act theory, which we're going to talk quite a bit when we talk about infants and preschoolers, because it's the framework in which we basically organize our thinking about early communicative intent in ways that we're analyzing communicative intent using Doerr's primitive speech acts. So it's ideas about speech acts could be things like the difference between labeling or commenting or requesting, and we'll get into that more as we get into other communication. And so support for this theory would be, certainly we do see a lot of attention on the need to communicate, and so that certainly we know that we're kind of biologically driven and created to want to be social beings. It's one of the things that is inherent in our human system. And another sort of support for this is if we look at certain disorders for which part of the primary premise of the disorder is a disability and the desire to socially be driven to communicate, or a social communication deficit like in autism, we do see much poorer language in children who don't have that social drive as a premise to their system. And some of the challenges to this theory, however, would be that, this driving force to communicate doesn't really help explain for the complex language that evolves. When we think about the complex syntax that is created in those first few years of life, just the drive to communicate doesn't explain why children would go from saying, I want cookies, to the cookies that are on our counter, something that I'd love to have, right? Those are two very different contexts, and it doesn't really help explain that. The last theory that I wanted to mention to you, and it's one that doesn't have quite the same level of popularity as some of the other ones that we've talked about, but one that I think is really a poignant one, is the child talk model. And that is a model that talks about the fact that children learn their language all through routines and experiences. For example, you talk about like maybe doing a play kitchen activity with a child just playing, or in an actual real kitchen, and that the idea is that children form a mental representation of what happens in this context, and all the language that they learn is based on these interactions. And so they're learning words like spoon, fork, and cup, and mix, and push, and cook, all within the context of these different events. So instead of thinking of words within sort of file drawers in your mind as like all in categories, a child talk model suggests that through all of these contextual interactions that children are learning language, and all these words that they're learning are early on are connected to specific routines and events. And so through these repeated experiences, we think the same thing like with reading a book. A child who's reading a book and there's repeated reading of an individual book, that children are learning the language of that book based on those repeated routines, and that's how all of that language is being stored rather than being stored connected to things or objects and so on. And so I think that is an interesting theory and probably has some merit when we think about what we do as speech language pathologists with young children, toddlers, and preschoolers, and so much of what we do is play-based. So that is the end of our conversation.